scientific contexts. One of the things I haven't mentioned to you yet that I have my PhD in cell biology, and I received that in 1990 from the University of New Mexico. And so I've gone through the Western science pipeline as an Indigenous person. So I want to share a little bit of the insights that I've gleaned as I've gone through that system and what it's felt like for me as an Indigenous person. And then I'm going to share a little bit of the Mohawk creation story, which is the story of Sky Woman, and touch base on the idea of oral traditions in Indigenous communities, and reflect on this idea of this diversiform nature. And I'll explain that a little bit more, but the diversiform nature of Indigenous storytelling is really about weaving together fabrics of multiple identities, of diverse identities, and making sure that when we share our stories, we make sure that there's never a single story, because that wouldn't include everybody in the community. Okay. So what is Indigenous science? We'll start with. My experience as an Indigenous person in Western scientific practice is the next thing. And then this model of Indigenous storytelling, this diversiform storytelling, that really invites multiple identities into the learning process. One of the people I followed through most of my career, as I've been thinking about what is Indigenous knowledge, is the work by Greg Cajete. And Greg Cajete is a professor at the University of New Mexico. He's a Tiwa, Native American, and he's been publishing books. You probably read one of his books, Native Science. He's published a more recent book in 2015 called Indigenous Community, Rekindling the Teachings of the Seventh Fire. And I think it's a really great book, and it's been lovely to watch Greg as he synthesized his ideas. And I think his ideas in this most recent book are really, really beautiful and condensed and strong. So he has a section in that book that's called What is Indigenous Science? And one of the first quotes that I pull out is, it's a body of traditional, environmental, and cultural knowledge unique to a group of people that has served to sustain that people through generations of living within a distinct bioregion. And so I think he's saying what I understand Indigenous knowledge is that it's really linked to a people who live in a particular space. And so it's really place-based knowledge. And people live in different spaces, and there are going to be different Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous science. And so it's not all going to be the same. Depends on what place you live in, and it's really connected to that place. The next quote that I think is really important is that Indigenous science applies what an Indigenous people have come to know and understand from our experience with a place in ways that ensure that the community carries on. And so that brings in this idea of sustainability education and the foundation of Indigenous science as a knowledge that is fundamentally based on sustainability. And the last quote that I think that comes from this section of his book, the inquiry of Indigenous science focuses on a specific place-based, and the most important goal of such an activity is to instill an understanding of how important sustainability is. And that's really my experience with Indigenous science. And in my own culture, many of the cultural practices and the values and beliefs and the way that we interact with each other are built around sustainability. and being able to survive. And I often think about what is it that creates sustainability in an Indigenous perspective. And I often think about um, the experience that I've had growing up in Western culture is is that thinking about children growing up in our schools is that some of our children have been meant to feel like they have gifts, but some of our children growing up in schools have not been made to feel like they have gifts to offer. And that is one of the things that really touches my heart about sustainability and thinking about Indigenous people. If Indigenous people were going to survive in a place, without grocery stores, without central heating, without all of these things that have come about, they really needed every member of their community to feel like they had a gift and to feel empowered in that community. And so the Indigenous knowledge structure was a structure that was very inclusive because we needed all of our children to feel that they were endowed with a gift and could contribute to the sustainability of that community. So we couldn't have some kids where we would think you are queer, and so you don't have a gift for our community. And so it's really an essential piece for Indigenous knowledge, that inclusivity. So now I want to turn to my experience of navigating the Western scientific academic space. And when I started my journey as an undergraduate at Eastern Montana College back in 1984, as an Indigenous person, when I entered into the biology program there, it was really clear that who I was as an Indigenous person didn't matter. It wasn't important. And at that point, when I first started my journey, was about right here. And this is what I call the I don't see you phase of Indigenous ways of knowing relating to Western STEM traditions. And so Western STEM traditions didn't acknowledge that Indigenous ways of knowing had anything to contribute at that time in my experience. And then by the time I graduated and got into graduate school, and that was about 6, 7 years later, there were people in at the University of New Mexico who were beginning, scientists who were beginning to say, well, when I look at Indigenous ways of knowing, I think there may be something there that's important for us to know. And so there was a starting recognition that Indigenous ways of knowing was relevant and important to modern scientific inquiry. And then after I graduated and then I started teaching in the early 90s, in the mid 90s, there were groups of people who began to see, well, if we look at Western scientific traditions and Indigenous ways of knowing, we can kind of put them together and through this Venn diagram, and we can see that there's some overlap. And I call this the Venn diagram phase. But in my experience as a Western scientific, Indigenous person who was practicing Western academic science, what was really my experience was please check your identity at the door. Who you are as an Indigenous person is not important to who you are as a scientist. And a few years ago, here at SKC, I was part of a research symposium for graduate students who visited from Montana State University. And one of the graduate students, his name was Matt, is Matt Weingarten, and he's from here. He's from Salish man, and he's from here. And he was doing his graduate work in fire sciences, and I was sitting in a room here at SKC with a lot of other Indigenous people, and I was watching Matt. And one of the things that I realized is that Matt hadn't checked his identity at the door. And so he was dealing in the looking at fire science in a modern contemporary perspective, but he was weaving into that the historical perspectives of his ancestors. He was using modern science. He was weaving in aspects, stories from elders, and weaving that into the work. And there was also this sense of using, looking at his ancestors' indigenous communities and using lake core samples to look at patterns of fire on the land, and using that as a way to learn more about his ancestors and how they managed fire on the land. And so at this point, I'm sitting there and I'm watching this Indigenous person doing STEM. And this Indigenous person wasn't asked to check their identity at the door. They were an Indigenous person doing STEM. And I was sitting there in the dark watching this research presentation that Matt was giving. And there was another woman sitting next to me, Alyssa Hawk, who was a student at SKC. And she leaned over to me and she whispered to me, she said, "Pinch me, is this really happening?" And from an Indigenous perspective, it was a really eye-opening experience. And I think what Matt was doing exemplifies this idea of a third space. And a third space is when we give students a chance to learn that invites them into the learning space. So they use their culture, their traditional practices, and weaving that learning into a forward-looking space. And that's, and this was is a set of theories put forth by Gutierrez and Tejada in 1999. It's a really fascinating look at how do we create learning spaces where learners don't have to check their identity and are who they are while they're doing the research or while they're doing the learning. So this is the pinch me phase, and it was a real transition for me. And I just want to point out that as on this kind of time scale from the past, as long as Western STEM traditions and Indigenous ways of knowledge stayed separate, that created a kind of static experience for me. But what I saw in this third space, what's happening in many places right now, is this evolutionary experience of people mixing cultures and STEM and science together from different cultures. And it's transformative. It's transformative for the students. As an Indigenous person, I can tell you, it's really transformative to me when I can do the work that I need to do as an Indigenous person. But I also want to point out that it's super transformative for science itself. And I think that's a really important place, that it's dynamic and transformative. So that's this third space, and I think when we create these third spaces, we are creating these transformative, forward-looking spaces that really support learning of all of our students. So I want to turn now to thinking about oral traditions within Indigenous context. And it's really the oral traditions that transmit Indigenous knowledge through a kind of diversiform fabric of different meanings that intentionally encompass the diverse identities that make up an Indigenous community. Indigenous storytellers, and as a storyteller within the Mohawk tradition, I've internalized this well, is that we internalize a way of telling stories where we feel responsible to tell stories in ways that ensure that there is never a single story. It's not just one story, that oral tradition has to be large enough, and it has to encompass and invite the identities of all of the people in the Indigenous group. And this is a part of a curricula that is transformative and anticipates change. So I wanted to just show you a little bit of what this actually looks like. And as I tell the story of Sky Woman, which is the Mohawk creation story. And I can't tell you the whole story because it would take all day to tell you that whole story. But I want to just tell you a little bit of the story. As I mentioned in my first, right at the beginning, I am a two-spirit trans Indigenous educator. And that's really an important thing for me. I know as a science educator, when I go into schools here on the Flathead Reservation or in Turtle Mountain or Northern Cheyenne, I know when I go into schools that there are students who many might be seeing a positive reflection of who they are for the first time, maybe 400 or 500 years. That the Indigenous sense of gender identity is not the same as the binary gender that we have internalized as part of Western culture. And that's such an important part. When I have listened to this story being told by a variety of people, Mohawk elders and other Mohawk people, what I hear is a story that's really woven within the gender binary of the Western experience. And I think as an Indigenous people, we are beginning to undo that legacy of colonization. And so let me tell a little bit of this story. And before I tell this story, I want to prepare to tell the story in as good way. So I'm going to just smudge myself. Smudge you a little bit too. So Sky Woman, this story begins in a place that's not here. the story begins in a place called Skyworld. And in that place, which is not this place, there were people living in that place. And at the center of that place was this tree. And this tree, not only did it provide all of the materials for their houses, fruit and food for them, it also provided medicines for them as well. The bark, the berries. And at the center of this sky world was this tree, and this tree was illuminating. It gave off a light. And there were people who lived there. And one of these people was Sky Woman. And the Mohawk literal translation means mature flower. And Sky Woman, when we meet her in the story, is really pregnant. She's in her 3rd trimester. She's feeling uncomfortable, and she's feeling very, very, very pregnant. And because she's feeling uncomfortable, she tells her partner, she says, "Woman, I'm not feeling well. Would you go to the tree of life and get some bark off the tree of life and bring it to me? And I'm going to make a tea of that. And I'm going to drink that tea, and it's going to make me feel better." And her partner gets big eyes. And she says, "You know we're not supposed to take anything off the tree. That we can only use what the tree gives us when it falls to the ground. So I feel really uncomfortable about going and getting bark off that tree for you." And Sky Woman says to her, "Just go get me some bark." And so Sky Woman's partner goes out of their house and goes to the tree in the center of that sky world. And she goes up to the base of the tree, and she reaches in to grab some of that bark off the tree. And when she reaches in to grab that bark, a big opening happens in front of her. It's like the tree parts, and what she can see is this beautiful blueness in front of her. And when she sees this, it scares her. And so she goes back to Sky Woman, and she says, "I know you really wanted me to get that bark for medicine, but this really strange thing happened when I went up to grab the bark." And Sky Woman says, "I knew that you weren't going to do this. I should have just done it myself." And so Sky Woman levers herself up and goes out of their house and goes to the tree. And she's going to grab some bark off of that tree, and so she can make a tea and make medicine to make her body feel better. And when she leans up and goes to grab some of that bark, this opening happens in front of her. And she sees this blueness, this beautiful blueness in front of her. And she leans back, and when she leans back, it closes. And when she leans forward, it opens again. And so she reaches in, and she's going to see what it's like, and she's reaching in, and the opening opens wider and wider, and she looks down through that opening, and she sees this blueness, this beautiful blueness. And as she's leaning over, something happens. She either loses her balance and begins to fall through this opening in her world. And as she starts to fall, she starts grabbing stuff around to try and hold on, and she grabs stuff in her hands that's fallen off the tree. and she falls through the hole. Now, I've heard the story told other ways. I've heard it told in a way that Sky Woman's partner had just had enough of her, and when Sky Woman was leaning over with her butt showing there, her partner pushed her in through the hole. I've also heard the story told that when Sky Woman saw this opening in this other world, she did a swan dive off into this other world. Now, I want to tell you the story, all the ways that I've heard the story, because I don't want to leave nothing out. I don't want to keep anything from you. I want you to hear the whole way I've heard it told. So Sky Woman has fallen through this hole into this world of blue, which is really the sky above our world, this world here. But as Sky Woman begins to fall and she looks down, all she sees is water. There's no land. And she's scared and she's screaming. And as she's falling through the sky, up high in the sky, she's falling down. Some cranes, a flock of cranes, see her, and they fly over to her, and they see this strange being that they've never seen before. And they look at her close, and they look at her hands, and her hands don't have any webbing, and her skin doesn't have any scales like fish. And their world is an aquatic world. There's only water. And she doesn't have any wings, so she can't fly. And so this flock of cranes swoop under her, get under her, and fly, and they gather her in their bodies, and they hold her. Now, I've heard the story told other ways as well. I've heard the story told that it was a flock of geese. And I've heard the story told that it was a flock of ducks. And I just want to make sure that I don't keep anything from you, that I tell you all the ways that I've heard the story. So now we have Sky Woman on the back of this flock of cranes. And the cranes are wondering, what are they going to do with this animal, this woman that they've never seen before, this being that they've never seen? What are they going to do with her? Well, they know that she came from up high, and so they try and fly up and return her to where she came from. But they soon realize that they don't have any place to take her, that there's no place up there to take her to take her back to. There's no place. And so they know that they have to do something with her. And so they send one of the cranes down to the water to have a council with other animals, with all of the other aquatic animals that are there. And to have a discussion, what do we do with this strange being that we've never seen before? And so they decide together that there is a big turtle in that council. And the big turtle says, I don't know what we're going to do with her in the long run, but for now, you can bring her down and put her on my back. And so the flock of cranes come down to the surface of the water, and they let Sky Woman onto the back of the turtle. And there are lots of animals around the turtle. And so they start talking and thinking and wondering what can they do for this strange creature, this creature that can't live in water. So they start telling stories, and one of the stories that gets told is that underneath the water, way down underneath the water, there's land. And they decide that if one of them can swim down, and they can get to the bottom of the water, and then they can scoop up some of that dirt and bring it back up, that maybe they can create a place for this strange being. And so the first animal tries is beaver, and beaver says, I'm a really strong swimmer. I'm going to swim down to the bottom and I'm going to get some of that dirt. And so beaver goes underneath. And beaver is gone for a long time. And all of the animals don't know what's happened to beaver. And eventually beaver's body bobs back up to the surface of the water, next to the turtle. And when they look at beaver, beaver's dead. He didn't make it. And so another animal, the otter, tries, and the otter slips into the water to go down to the bottom to get some of that dirt. And otter has gone a long time. And eventually otter's body bobs back up to the top. And when they roll otter over and look at otter, otter didn't make it either. Otter died. Died trying to get some of that dirt. And a lot of other animals try this as well. And after a while, after many of the animals have tried to get that dirt, but have died in the process, a little muskrat swims over and says, I am not a strong swimmer, but I'm going to try this. I'm going to try to get some of that dirt. So the little muskrat slips into the water. And again, the muskrat's gone a long time. And eventually, the muskrat's body comes back up to the surface next to the side of the turtle. And Sky Woman picks up muskrat and rolls him over in her hands and looks at him. And muskrat didn't make it either. Like all the other animals, he perished. But when Sky Woman rolls him over and looks in one of his paws, she opens that paw up, and in the bottom of that paw is some dirt. And she puts it in her hand. And she lays muskrat down. And then Sky Woman does something because of the magic of being a pregnant woman. She starts doing a sidestep dance and singing and going all around the edge of the turtle. And as she sings, she puts the soil down on the back of the turtle. And as she dances this old dance that has been danced many, many times, the turtle begins to grow. And she keeps dancing, and the turtle continues to grow. And after a while, when she looks up, the turtle has grown so big that she can't even see the edge anymore. And this is the story about the creation of Turtle Island or Turtle Continent. Now the story goes on from there, and it takes a long time to tell the rest, so I'm going to stop there. But Indigenous science and Indigenous knowledge is an oral tradition, and it's passed on by people telling stories, passing that knowledge on, and people sharing their practices and telling stories and passing those practices on. But it's really important to understand that when the storyteller tells those stories, that they make sure and invite multiple diverse ideas and perspectives into that story. So that story has a home for everyone that hears it. So every child that hears that story can hear and see themselves as part of that story. And that's what makes it Diversiform. And when the storyteller stops and says, but I've heard that story told in other ways, that's an important element of the storytelling that invites different identities and different perspectives into the story, and is the way that the storyteller ensures that there's never just a single story. So what have we explored? We've explored that Indigenous inquiry is rooted in place and how to live there in a sustainable way. We've learned that when we create third spaces where learners do not have to check their identities at the door, we invite their culture and their practices into learning. Gutierrez and Tejada point out that third spaces need to be grounded in students' historical and contemporary particulars. Thinking back to Matt Weingarten's story, as he explored what was his ancestors' practices around fire management, and pulling that traditional knowledge into the future by grounding it in modern science. To create that third space, we have to orient learning towards imagined possible future. And finally, we've explored the idea of diversiform storytelling and how it provides a model to create inclusive learning spaces for sustainable food systems. I'd like to stop there and take any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Robbins. That was wonderful. And your model of diversiform storytelling really resonates with me, and a lot of the work that I do in Indigenous communities, specifically in Yunnan province in China. They have a very strong tradition of storytelling and oral narration, where a lot of Indigenous knowledge, including about food plants and the origins of different foods and seeds, is really passed on through storytelling, as well as sustainability practices for the environment and for food systems. And something that I've also noticed in those communities is the open-ended and inclusive nature of the storytelling, where while somebody's telling a story, other people have the space and are invited to share their perspectives of how they've heard the story or their versions of the story, which may be more based in their family's identity. So this model really resonates with me, and I'm eager to begin to think about ways that we can integrate this into our classrooms for sustainable food systems education. So thank you so much for sort of laying out the framework, telling this beautiful story. I also very much appreciated your inclusion of ceremony before you told us story. I really valued that, and the framework of the third space. I would actually, yeah, love to open it up for questions, but also for reflections, perhaps. If anybody wanted to reflect on anything that has been shared, as well as if you have ideas of how you can incorporate this model into your classrooms or your programs. You can unmute yourself.
Hi, Selena. Hi, Selena. Let's see. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Dr. Robbins, for your presentation. The multiform story is just such an exciting way of thinking about how we approach our content and how we approach our students as well. Your intro reminded me of a story my supervisor told me when he first got into undergraduate science, and he was told explicitly in the large lecture hall to leave his emotions at the door because good science doesn't need them and they get in the way. And that always stuck out with him to him, and he would repeat it to his students, but in a way to say, but not in, for when he started teaching, he would say, not in this science classroom. We're going to acknowledge that you are, A, that's impossible, B, we want you to bring it. And it did, I think it did help students connect to science better, although science still has a long way to go to help kind of minimize its trauma on students. My one question was, I'm assuming you teach science students at various stages, and wondering how you and when you, or what strategies you have that kind of help massage out a bit of the scar tissue of science education that students probably have before they reach you, so that they're more receptive to this way of knowing and being in a science classroom. Because I imagine you don't start day one with this particular activity, or perhaps you do. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I actually go into a lot of elementary schools and tell this story. And I've gone into middle schools and high schools and have told this story. And, you know, you bring students into a circle, you do a bit of ceremony, you sing a song, and you tell that emotional story. And it's really life-changing for students to hear that story, because many students, because they've been told that their emotions and who they are as knowers and beers are not important to the story itself, because there's this single story, it's this abstract story of Western scientific perspective. They're really moved by this, and right from the get-go, I think it's a life-changing experience for them. And one of the things that I'm very grateful for as a two-spirit is that I know that this story has been told for the last 300-400 years from the gender binary of man and woman. And when I tell the story, I don't tell it from that binary. I tell it from a very different perspective that includes who I am and who I say. And I think the reemergence of two spirits into Indigenous communities is really helping Indigenous communities begin to remember what did gender look like in their traditional communities, and really helps all of us, Indigenous or non-Indigenous, to begin to critically deconstruct, decolonize our sense of gender identity. Let's see, you had two parts of that question. What was the other part of that question?
The other was, my assumption was that, and I didn't realize that it was in elementary school and with youth, which is wonderful. I was thinking of adult learners who might have already gone through, if you present these ways of knowing and exploring science education with adult learners who might have already developed problematic identity with science, and then when asked to, in a science classroom, to engage with these ways of knowing, expressing, and feeling, how do you prepare them for that, if you do this type of activities with those types of learners?
Yep, that's such a great question to ask. And you know, the first thing I have to do, even with all students that I work with, adult students in college, is I have to get them to believe that who they are and their voice matters. And so it's really important to create dialogic classrooms where we're really, and you're right, because students often come into my general bio class and they'll think that education's about them listening to this presentation about the structure of chloroplasts, and who they are and what they think about chloroplasts is irrelevant. And I have to deconstruct that for them, and I have to, you know, little by little get them to understand that their understanding of chloroplasts is what I need to know. What do they know about chloroplasts? What don't they? What do they wonder about chloroplasts? And so, you know, in culturally sustaining pedagogy, the kind of the things that we're talking about, this third space, is that we really have to view learners as resources, not as vessels that we put stuff in. And it takes a lot of scaffolding. You got to start little by little, but you do have to demonstrate to them one way or the other, and we'll all do it in different ways, that their voice matters.
I see a comment from Marie Spiker. Marie, do you mind unmuting and sharing?
Sure thing. Yeah, happy to do that. And I'll turn on my so wanted to thank you so much, Dr. Robbins, and I really appreciate this idea of holding space for people to say, I've heard that story in a different way. And it just makes me think there's so many issues that we debate in the Western scientific world where there's so many different perspectives, and we don't always invite people to share those perspectives in an inclusive way. Oftentimes it's very territorial, like, let me put out my paper to show that I'm right and you're wrong, and you know, I'll leave the door open for you to do the same. So this is such an important practice in the classroom, but I can see Diversiform storytelling is something that's so important for research, and research thinking of sort of this shared fabric and resource that we build together. And if we bring this perspective in, you know, what a powerful paradigm shift. So thank you.
You know, one of the ways I foster this in classrooms, this gets back again to Will's question, is that I use reflection. And it was nice to hear you ask for reflection, Selena. But in classrooms where I'm teaching, one of the routines that I get students used to is spending 5 minutes quietly reflecting on a set of prompts that I give them. And so I give them 5 minutes quiet. There'll be 3 prompts, like in the section we've read, what just really stood out to you. So I give them an objective question. Then the next question is, what's your experience with that? And then the third question is, what does that mean for understanding bioenergetics? And so I go through this reflect, share routine, and I build that over time in the class, where students get really used to really just sitting down for 5 minutes and coming up with thoughtful, connected answers, and then sharing that. And so doing peer teaching, because I believe when, you know, another part of Indigenous learning, which makes it sustainable, is when we see learning as something that grows out of the wisdom of the community. And so I think students learn, and there's a lot of great examples where peer teaching in K-12 and in college is a technique that produces a lot of learning, a lot more than lecturing. And so when you ask these questions, I often ask an objective question, a reflective question, an interpretive question, and then sometimes a decisional question. And this grows out of the work, out of a book, and I can't think of the book right now, but it's called Orid. But really engaging the community giving them time to reflect, and then giving them time to share. And that takes a while for them to get used to that sharing. But after a while, they get it, and they begin to weave. And then I know what they're thinking.
If you have any reflections you would like to share or questions, you can unmute your mic.
Can I jump in? Thank you for that. Yeah, beautiful storytelling, and it's wonderful having heard little bits of this Sky Woman story to hear more. So thank you. I was also intrigued at the beginning when you started with the Mohawk Nyawan idea that we need each other. And I've heard a little bit about Haudenosaunee culture, but not that aspect. And I was wondering if you could share a little more about that.
Well, that grows out of what's come to known as the Thanksgiving address, and that's how you begin the Thanksgiving address. And there is this, and as we think about teachers, we think about routines, right? What are the things that we do repeatedly that help students understand where they need to be, what they need to do, right? And so this is very much woven in this Indigenous pedagogy, is that before we start telling the Thanksgiving address, that we begin by first saying, before we start anything important, we always want to acknowledge each other and acknowledge that we need one another. So I need you. I need you.
Beautiful, thank you.
I need you. And it's a beautiful way of weaving people together that really brings them heart-centered and feeling like they're valued, especially if it comes from someone who's carrying status or power in the situation, right?
Right, yes.
So it's an ancient pedagogy that helps.
I love the way you left such a pause after you shared that too, to just really let it sit for everyone. Beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I saw a hand raised from Natalia.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that. And I wanted to share that, I guess, unknowingly, we've been using Diversiform storytelling, and I wanted to share how effective it's been. We've been working with farmers and ranchers in California that have been impacted by wildfire. And so we've been sharing their stories and inviting them to share their stories, including working with some tribes up north and sharing their stories of fire and what their experience was before and after and in recovery. And by bringing other people's stories, we've found that it helps farmers and ranchers just to, by listening, knowing what to look out for, how to be prepared for that next fire potentially. And some farmers love it, and then some really just want the more scientific approach of this is what you need to do. But we found that that storytelling has really allowed farmers to connect to each other and pass down more of the scientific knowledge of what they need to do to prepare without it being so intrusive or analytical and boring. So thank you for sharing that. And I think I'd like to think about how more ways to integrate it in a Diversiform, meaning where you have potentially one farm that has a certain practice, but then you have maybe a different farm in the same region that has a very different approach. So how to make it a diverse story of the same lived experience of the same fire. So lots of ideas. Thank you.
Yeah, that's an Indigenous pedagogy too. Understanding that knowledge is distributed, and it's distributed in our community. And one of the things that I've seen, and I agree completely with you, is when I've seen real transformation around knowledge, it's not been when someone has shared a story, it's been when people share stories that I see real transformation, and that it comes out of that bank of community wisdom, and it's transformative. So thank you for sharing that story.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Natalia, for sharing about your work and how you're using storytelling in response to the wildfire. That's really inspiring, and I would love to hear other ideas that you have as this webinar sort of sits with you. So yeah.
Super cool. What are some of the stories that you heard, Natalia?
Well, I think I'm a terrible storyteller. My Irish friends always make fun of me for being such a bad storyteller. So I won't even try to repeat the stories. But one of my favorites is from a woman who describes how after it's a tribe up in the north, I forget which one, but when they use fire to clear their lands, to basically prescribed burning, they come to it as a grandmother and grandchild, as an entire community, and then they sit back and watch as the wildlife come back, as the deer come back, as the earth kind of is replenished and is brought back to life. And so I think that was one of the most inspiring stories, was hearing about their way of relating to their environment and how much it changes the view of, when it's a really packed forest, and that's a real forest. No, but in the contrary, they say it needs to breathe, it needs to have fresh air. But in terms of a story of someone that was impacted by fire, there were a few that talked about how traumatic it was, and it's really like you have to hold a container, being able to sit with that experience of losing everything. But they talk about little things that you wouldn't have thought of, that probably an extension agent or a university professor teaching farmers would have never thought about. For example, a fence that was burnt down because the fire went through and their fence was made out of wood, and then all of their livestock left their land. Or when their irrigation was above ground, they lost all of their irrigation, and then they had a ton of water that was just being released, and they were losing a lot of their water because of that. So these little tidbits, as they share their experience of the fire, allow farmers to think, okay, well, I should probably move toward not having plastic irrigation, and I should think about having metal fencing instead of wooden fencing, things like that.
Cool. I found that so to be true, that when people share stories, we learn so much more than if we just hear a single view of that, and we invite. A lot of times people wonder, well, how do you engage students who come from different cultures or come from different places? And I think this is one of the ways that you invite who they are into this space. And when you invite who they are, they bring their culture, right? And as teachers, we don't want to impose our understanding of their culture, because we might just recreate stereotypes around that. But if we create an inclusive place and we invite them to share their stories, their culture is now in our space. And if we can honor the stories that get told in our space, and it's an easy thing to do, right? Because stories are really powerful. They weave together theory, analysis, and experience into this place where people feel like they're part of that. And then it begins to create a tapestry of different stories that allow us to see things from multiple dimensions, which really improves our understanding of almost anything.
One of our farmers said it's a type of wet learning instead of like a dry learning. where you learn by connectivity and connecting to people's experience rather than just from information dump.
I love that.
There's a book that I use when I'm working with elementary. I think I have it. It's called I Know the Moon. And this is a beautiful book if you're working with elementary students, because these animals come to the man of science and they ask him, what is the moon? And the man of science gives them a very dry, crusty, and each of the animals then go on and say, but that's not how I know the moon. You know, the mouse knows the moon in a way, and the owl knows the moon. And when you think about the stories that these different animals tell, it's amazing the insights that those animals tell. And if you can invite those animal stories into your story about the moon, you create this three-dimensional understanding that engages learners in a way that, and I love the man. I don't mean to put down the man of science. I've been the person of science myself, and I love science. When I think about the story of Sky Woman as a creation story, and then I think about the Big Bang, which is also a creation story. And it's a beautiful creation story, too. And when these creation stories work together, there's this powerful synergy that happens between them. And we also realize that the Big Bang is a story as well. And it's a powerful story. But it is a story.
I would love to hear from the participants if you have other ways of or models of creating a third space. So we learned about diversiform storytelling as one model of creating a third space. And I would love to hear if others of you have other ways of creating a third space in your classrooms.
Actually, everyone. I think that what Dr. Robbins talked about, the role of reflection in science education, is for us one of our most. It's a hardest sell at the beginning, but we see the growth and development and the ability to articulate significance and implications, as well as using reflection in personal presentations as kind of like a our students usually in second year are quite nervous about publicly presenting, so we'll say, start with a personal reflection. It's something you won't have to worry about being questioned on the accuracy, within reason, and it really helps. It helps in so many different ways in a science classroom. In some ways, of like an antidote to other dimensions of the culture of science that prevents them from being themselves. So I just wanted to echo as well, saying that. That the self-reflection and the critical reflection process and scaffolding across the science degree program, I think really helps. It helps become better at science, but also acknowledging that our students are more than just future scientists or future, our students have histories, have dreams, aspirations, and by knowing them, bringing them in and exploring them through reflection, it helps them understand science better. So I just want to echo that importance of reflection in science education and how much it relates.
And what kind of students do you work with? Is it Will?
Mm-hmm. I'm at the University of British Columbia in the Faculty of Land and Food Systems. So it's students who are studying agroecology, food science, nutrition, dietetics, food resource economics, always forget a few, but kind of across the broad range of the food system. And then they are required to take courses together throughout their degree program. So usually large classes, but with smaller breakout rooms. And yeah, so we focus on the food system and interdisciplinarity. But the reflective part for me is really what helps thread it together and acknowledge more than just the scientific or natural science components of our food system and of their learning.
Powerful.
But I would say they do come in with an identity of, I'm becoming a scientist. I'm in a natural science program, kind of that developing of an identity and kind of excluding other identities at the same time. So we try to help give options to soften that identity so it doesn't get too hard and limiting.
Do you use, do you invite different voices into your classes?
We try to as much as possible. We begin with interdisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity within our faculty. But then in first year and then second year, we try to bring that beyond our academic faculty to the arts and humanities, social sciences. And by third year, we try to then bring in community perspectives and practitioner, local, Indigenous ways of knowing. And fourth year is a combination of the three. So we try to be gentle with our invitation of pluralism. We try to do it not too quickly. Sometimes it doesn't feel fast enough, but we try to be patient with how we let it unfold. And I think recently one of our groups is interested in pushing the boundary on like the other than human perspectives as well. And how do we bring that better into our curriculum? But we're in the fact of natural science, we have to be careful with how far we stretch our colleagues and ourselves. So it also feels kind of a slow process.
You know, one of the lessons I do with my science teachers that I work with involves the question, who is our teacher? And from an Indigenous perspective, our teacher is nature. That we learn from animals and we learn from plants, and that's where our knowledge grows. It's not from man of science. So I think that's a really important question to bring up in the work you do. Who is our teacher? And when you think about the absolute critical nature of observation and being present to nature in terms of growing the natural sciences, that's your stick that gets beyond, you know, you should weed that right in, that you're training people to be grounded in evidence, and that evidence should come from nature because you're in natural sciences.
Thank you. I'm always looking for good angles.
Everybody, I put a link in the chat, and it's to Django Paris's paper. I don't know if you've read it, on culturally sustaining pedagogy, but it's a really transformative paper, and I invite all of you to, if you're thinking about creating culturally sustaining pedagogy or plants, you know, sustainable agricultural learning, this is a really great paper for you, and it really gives one of the best descriptions of third space. It gives a great history of how we've moved through our pedagogical frameworks from seeing kids as problems to, you know, to seeing them as resources for learning. It's a great paper. You can follow that link and then you can just download it.
I see a comment from our new Raja, if you want to share. You can unmute your mic.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks. I thought I sent the message to everyone. I was having some issues with the speaker, so I was not very sure. Anyway, I wanted to say thank you for this wonderful presentation. I took away a lot of things. It was really nice to hear what Will mentioned. And I appreciated the angle with, you know, what you mentioned, Dr. Robbins. How do you who is our teacher, right? I'm from India, and so I grew up there a bit. I grew up there here a bit in the U.S. and something I learned from watching my father, who was a scientist, and most of my family who worked with the land. We are agriculturists, basically. My father was a soil microbiologist. So being with him in the land and being with the farmers out there, my lessons were always with my teacher is the soil. My teacher are the people who work with the soil with their hands. The stories come from their hands and their feet, because that's how we experience soil, through our nose, the aroma of the soil. In different seasons, there's different ways we resonate with what's around us. So I saw my father when he went to meet the farmers. That was what I was taking away from him. So you can be a scientist, like you can be trained in the sciences, but you are actually a better scientist maybe if you are able to bring what you learn from the people, from the farmers, and be able to communicate both ways. So yeah, I mean, hearing all of you speak, and it transported me a little bit to my childhood. I really love the story of what you told about this woman who fell into the blue, and I feel like I have read this story before, but I can't point where. But it resonates with me very much. So I wanted to say thank you for sharing all this. It's been a very special talk. Thanks very much.
Thank you. You are more than welcome. It's an honor.
We have a question from the University of Vermont from Martha Castle. She has a lot of noise behind her, so I'm going to ask the question on her behalf. She would like to ask about third space creation in terms of alternative spaces, outside, moving, etc., as well as the incorporation of art and music into bringing out voices, perspectives, and memories.
I think music, you know, one of the things I've been fascinated by is a lot of Indigenous videos of young Indigenous people re-synthesizing their understanding of their culture through hip hop. And so when you're creating a third space for learners, you have to create a space that imagines who they are into this. You know, you can't over, the word is not coming to me. You can't make culture a thing, because, you know, learners, kids, young adults, they're experiencing their culture through the lens of the 21st century. And they are using art, they are using music, they're using tattoo, hip hop music, and it's very fluid how they're interpreting their own cultural foundations through the modern modes of expression. And I think in order to create that open space, we have to embrace that rather than try and say what it means to us, what culture means to us. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And it makes me think, and this is more of a flathead reference, but the video that was put together by the tribe, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, for encouraging people to wear face masks during COVID. And they invited a younger artist who, you know, had used hip hop as well as, you know, traditional, or their interpretation of, you know, traditional cultural aspects and integration with the landscape. And I thought that was a really powerful example, you know, of interpretation of culture, but making it very relevant for current times, and also being a really powerful message that people could connect to, and very educational.
Well, that's when we perpetuate culture, when we make it relevant to contemporary knowers.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really, as I have teachers who are elders, and I think I think young ones are really interested in listening to the context of elders, and I think that's really important. It's important for me, but you know, as a teacher, as an Indigenous teacher, I want to share aspects of what the elders have told me, but also I want to make sure that young ones have access to that knowledge and internalize it, because it's still there, even if it's being expressed with a hand drum doing a hip hop melody. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, you've given us so many things to think about. This has been really powerful, and I'm looking forward to thinking about ways that I can incorporate a Diversiform storytelling into the classroom, as well as other modalities for creating the third space. And thank you so much to Dr. Robbins and to all of our participants. I very much appreciated you all being here. And yes, please do follow up with any ideas for future webinars. Our next webinar is going to be in 2 weeks on November 5th at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, 11 a.m. here in Montana, 1 p.m. on the East Coast, by Dr. Lina Yamashita, and she is going to be speaking and sharing about her approach on critical food literacy through multicultural texts. And so I hope those of you who are able will join us in 2 weeks from now, and please be in touch with any ideas for future webinars. And again, Dr. Robbins, thank you so much. That was really powerful. And I feel like your model very much resonates with the Indigenous cultures that I've been in, with Diversiform storytelling, and you've put it together in such a nice framework that that really brings it together. So, and that can be applied, which I think is really powerful. It's something that I know occurs, but I didn't really know what was happening. So the way you've put it together is really powerful. So thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for attending. It was a real honor to be in circle with you.
Thank you, Dr. Robbins. Thanks, Selena, for organizing as well.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much. That was great.
Thank you, Dan.